Missouri School of Journalism. Welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. 2015 has been a big and controversial year so far for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In March, Netanyahu addressed a joint session of the U.S. Congress in an effort to scuttle U.S. talks with Iran, a move that was seen by many as antagonistic towards President Obama. Then 2 weeks later, Netanyahu pulled off a surprisingly comfortable victory in national elections, as his center-right Likud party won the most seats in parliament. Netanyahu's strategy was bold. Already conservative, he ran further to the right in the closing days of the elections. He said there would be no Palestinian state on his watch, backing away from a cornerstone of Middle East diplomacy for years. On election day, he warned of his Arab Israelis voting in droves, a startling condemnation of voter participation by citizens of his own country. Still, the victory has allowed him to form a government with other conservatives and ultra-Orthodox Jewish parties. With the victory, Netanyahu is set to be the longest tenured prime minister in Israeli history. This week, we'll look at what Netanyahu's new government means for Israel, its relationship with its neighbors, as well as the U.S. and Europe. We'll also look at what it says about Israel's changing electorate and whether it's a milestone indicating Israel has become a fundamentally more conservative place. Joining us from Haifa, Israel, Patrick Strickland, a freelance journalist who focuses on human rights and social justice. His work has been featured in Vice News, Al-Jazeera English, and other international media outlets. And from Washington, D.C., Greg Myre. Greg is the digital editor for international news at NPR. Previously, he was a foreign correspondent in Jerusalem for the Associated Press and the New York Times. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Greg Myre, you were in Jerusalem from 2002 to 2007, 2003 to 2007, if I have that right. Do you think that the electorate has significantly changed inside Israel since then? Are Israelis fundamentally more conservative?
I would say that the electorate definitely has moved to the right. You go back, they've won really every election since 2001. And you had Ariel Sharon winning a couple of elections. Netanyahu's now won 3 consecutive elections. And I think it's clear, and I think there's a couple reasons for that. One has been the security situation. There was a Palestinian uprising from 2000 to 2005. We've seen all the turmoil in Arab countries in recent years. That's certainly made Israelis a little more skittish about the security situation. That's one factor. And then there's demographics, which are also a big factor. And I think that the people who tend to vote more conservative in Israel are growing in number, and the traditional liberals, the Jews of European descent, the Ashkenazis, are becoming a smaller part of the population. So I think the security situation, the demographic trends, and just you've had these large figures in Sharon and Netanyahu, and they've been the dominant players, and all these factors have combined, I think, to make Israel a more conservative society.
Patrick Strickland, you're in Israel now. There are some people actually on the Israeli right who, in spite of this victory, would argue that the electorate has basically stayed fairly centrist in Israel, and that, in fact, much of the media in Israel is dominated by left-wing political figures, and they're sort of overblowing shifts in Israel's political views. What do you make of that?
I would certainly agree that the electorate has continually moved right-wing. I think that that's a process that started initially as a blowback to the Oslo Accords, the initial agreements with the Palestinians in 1994 that set out the basis for a two-state solution. Now, since that time, though, there's been a kind of ups and downs. It comes in lulls, but particularly since the time that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was re-elected in 2009, we've seen a very, very sharp shift in the Israeli electorate. You can see that reflected on the ground. During the last war on Gaza, for instance, you could see some rather outright racism at certain protests, right-wing protests, people chanting death to Arabs and so on. Some of the rhetoric that politicians have been using has grown increasingly, I would say outright racist at times, and the incitement has at times gotten kind of out of control. So I would say that there's no doubt that they've continually moved rightward, both in terms of the actual political leadership as well as the electorate.
And Greg Myre, if you would, just tell us do you have a sense as to what this means for both the Palestinians and Israeli Arabs living inside Israel, does this fundamentally alter their lives, or is this something that doesn't really affect people on a day-to-day level?
No, I think it is significant. We haven't had real, sincere, serious peace negotiations in almost 15 years. I mean, there was a bout under Ehud Olmert around 2007, 2008. But aside from that, we haven't seen any real progress. The emphasis, there's been a real stasis and not much movement, and that's on the Palestinian issue. And we've really lost a generation almost. You look back to where they were in the 90s, and that atmosphere has not been around for 15 years now. And also we've seen the issue of the Israeli Arabs, who've always complained about discrimination and a second-class status. But I think that's become a little more acute in recent years. There have been a few more Israeli politicians have attacked them a little more directly. The friction has increased a bit. And so I think there's some issues there that you probably wouldn't have seen 15, 20 years ago.
Patrick Strickland, I mentioned that on Election Day, Prime Minister Netanyahu had warned that Israeli Arabs were voting in droves. I understand he apologized for this after the election, but this was really a shocking sort of political statement, at least as perceived by many people outside of Israel. How was it taken inside Israel?
I would say that it would only be shocking for those who are outside of Israel and Palestine. Not only is it somewhat mild for Netanyahu, it's part and parcel of the way that he's governed the country for the last 6 years. He's by no means the only political figure in high-ranking status who uses this kind of rhetoric. While it was very alarmist, it was an electoral tactic, and you know what? At the end of the day, it worked. He riled up right-wing voters by building up a threat of so-called threat of Arab voters who are carry Israeli citizenship and have that right like anyone else in the country. But it's not that much different. And compared to some folks, it's actually quite mild. If you look at then Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman called for certain Arab Israelis, as they're so called, who I think usually call themselves Palestinian citizens of Israel, to be beheaded with an axe if they oppose the Jewish nature of the state. So I mean, this is nothing new. I think Palestinians are quite used to it. I think folks here are quite used to it as well, I mean, Israelis as well.
This is Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. This week, a look at Israel's recent elections and what it means for the country and its foreign policy going forward. Joining us from Israel, Patrick Strickland, a freelance journalist who focuses on human rights and social justice, and from Washington, D.C., Greg Myre, the digital editor for international news at NPR and a former Middle East correspondent. If you're interested in more Global Journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues and download past episodes from our archive. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Global Journ. Greg Myre, tell us about Israel's relations with the United States, because there have been some testy exchanges between the White House and Prime Minister Netanyahu. But certainly the Republicans running in 2016 are all perceived as much more sympathetic to Netanyahu, and the Israeli right, Hillary Clinton, is seen that way as well. Is this just sort of a hiccup in U.S. relations with Israel, or is there some sort of more fundamental gap between the U.S. electorate and the Israeli electorate that didn't exist 10 or 20 years ago?
Yeah, good points all, Jason. I think it's very key to make a distinction here. On one level, in terms of security and military cooperation and the way they're looking at the broader Middle East, the U.S. and Israel are still largely in sync on most issues. There are things like the Iran nuclear deal, but in general, there's still a lot of cooperation going on. I don't think there's been a fundamental change in that relationship, nor is there likely to be. At the personal level, between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu, there's really been friction from the very beginning. It's only gotten worse. Really little possibility that it's going to get any better during the last 2 years of the Obama administration. In fact, it could intensify if the Iranian nuclear deal is reached. So that I expect to stay quite hostile and not on bad footing. Then there is the longer-term relationship, where I think a lot of older Americans tended to see Israel as this underdog that was always fighting for its life. And I think there's a younger younger generation of Americans, and certainly on college campuses, where often they see Israel as the occupier in the West Bank, have a stalemate with the Palestinians that needs to get resolved, and Israel is seen as the aggressor or the occupier. And I think Israel in the longer term is going to face a lot more pressure. We've already seen it in Europe, and I think we're starting to see it in the United States. So I think there are these distinctions to be made between short-term, middle, and longer term.
Patrick Strickland, one of the most criticized policies of the recent conservative governments in Israel has been the expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank on land that was conquered from the Palestinians in the 1967 war. Do you see that this policy is going to continue, will accelerate, may slow down over the coming years?
I think that whether or not negotiations start again, we will see that the expansion of settlements will continue unabated unless the United States comes around and decides to put pressure on Israel in a meaningful way, which means suspending aid packages, suspending military aid, cutting off the blank check that Israel's been given for the last several decades. But that seems immensely unlikely at this time.
And Greg Myre, if you wanted to address that question, please do so. But I also wanted to ask you, there had been this hope that Netanyahu, for some time at least, would be sort of a Nixon to China figure, and that he would be sort of this charismatic, strong right-wing figure who could sort of reach across to Israel's enemies and make peace with them in a way that a left-wing figure couldn't. Is there still that sort of hope?
I really don't see it. I mean, he's been a major figure. He was, for his first term, remember, was from 1996 to 99, so that's 20 years ago. The peace talks pretty much sputtered to a halt during his first term, and there were multiple factors involved, but Netanyahu was not a big fan of the peace process then, even in that decade when there was optimism that there could be a solution reached. And certainly the last 6 years when he's been prime minister, we haven't seen any real progress there. I think we're at the stage where we've seen Netanyahu in office almost a decade. He's really been the dominant figure for much of the past 20 years, and you just haven't seen that reaching out in a way that is likely to bring about a solution. Also, the dynamics of the region are not very helpful right now. I think as Israel looks around and sees all the chaos in the Arab world around them, they're thinking we don't want to be taking any risk with the Palestinians. I think that's the mood of a big part of the population. You bring all these factors together, and I really don't see a lot of hope for advancement on that front.
Patrick Strickland, a lot of people in the U.S. do see that many of Israel's enemies are the U.S.'s enemies: Hezbollah, Iran, the Islamic State, Hamas. And so the question for them is why should the U.S. be pressuring Israel to take steps that may weaken it, to slow down building settlements when it is surrounded by groups like this?
Well, I think that Israel's neighbors, to some extent, that's irrelevant. I mean, whether or not Iran's next door or Iran's on the border in Syria these days is irrelevant to the fact that Israel's breaking international law time and again in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the besieged Gaza Strip. So simply for the fact that the U.S. should not be aiding actively and promoting policies in which international law is continually broken, which at the end of the day translates into more and more, violations of Palestinian human rights, more dispossession, more displacement. In the long run, it can only do damage to the U.S.'s relations in the region as well. And as you said, the region's changing now. The U.S.'s strongmen, such as dictator Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, is now gone, and we see people that the U.S. has either had, a strong relationship with or a de facto peaceful relationship with being replaced left and right. So, I mean, there's no one to predict what's going to come afterwards. I think it would be in the best interest of the United States to pressure Israel to respect international law, including allowing Palestinian refugees to return to their homes, which is enshrined in international law, including ending the occupation of the 1967 territories, and including granting full and equal rights to those Palestinians who live in present-day Israel and carry Israeli citizenship, which is often seen in their eyes as nominal.
The outcome of the most recent Israeli elections don't indicate that the Israeli government has a lot of interest in making those kinds of concessions, it would seem. But Greg, I did want to ask you, there have been a lot of predictions that demographic changes in Israel and the Palestinian territories would herald sort of a change in Israeli politics because the Arab population, the Palestinian population, has been growing faster than the Jewish population. And yet the election results perhaps haven't been what people had expected because of these demographic changes. Can you tell us just a little bit about why that is?
Sure. You know, I don't have the magic ball on this, but in general, I think what your question is getting at is the number of Palestinians or Arabs is increasing. We're talking about both Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, as well as Palestinians or Arabs inside Israel. And then at some point in the fairly near future, they're going to outnumber the Jews in Israel if you take the two populations collectively, and that therefore Israel is in this situation of, does it want to be a Jewish state and a democratic state, or does it want to be seen as this occupier over a majority Arab population? Now, it's not going to be, there's not going to be some day when there's going to be one more Arab than Jew in this region, and therefore somehow magically things will transform or change.
Patrick, if I could get you to look in the crystal ball just a bit, where do you see things going? What do you think Israel will look like? What do you think the Palestinian territories will look like 5 years from now? How is the dynamic likely to shift in the coming years?
Right, I think we're likely to see much of what we've been seeing for the last 6 years of Netanyahu's governance. He's vowed to continue building in occupied East Jerusalem as well as the rest of the occupied West Bank. I think we're very, very likely to see another war in Gaza. Until now, I've just recently returned from Gaza. The situation is absolutely untenable. Until now, the vast majority of homes have not been rebuilt. Much of that has to do with the international community's failure to make good on its promises, on the $5.6 billion that were promised, as well as Israel's denial of many different types of building materials and other.
This was in reconstruction aid to help Gaza rebuild after the last war. That's
right. And as well as many basic humanitarian aid packages and so on and so forth. Now, the situation in Gaza today, with it being 100% closed off, with the rare exception that Egypt opens the border, or the rare exception that a Palestinian in Gaza can get a permit to pass through an Israeli border, is absolutely untenable. People are very, very angry, upset. Gaza is running out of water. Food is scarce. I think we're very, very likely to see another conflict there in the next 2 years. And I think that even the Israeli establishment is quite aware of that. Now, how the international community will respond will be the true test. So far, the international community has failed the Palestinians in large, and especially the Palestinians in Gaza, in the wake of this last war.
Patrick Strickland, Greg Myre, thank you for joining us on Global Journalist. Not everyone, however, believes Israel is moving to the right. Earlier, I had a chance to speak with Dan Schueftan, the director of the National Security Studies Center at the University of Haifa. Before that, he was a visiting professor at the Department of Government at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I started by asking him if Israel is becoming a fundamentally more conservative place.
No, I very strongly disagree, but I understand the reason for the confusion. You see, people are confusing between what's happening to the Israeli society and what's happening to the Israeli political system. We have a very impressive society, resilient, pluralistic. Anything good that you can possibly say about a society is reflected in what's happening in Israel today. On the other hand, we have a very deeply dysfunctional political system. And here is the interesting paradox. The political system doesn't reflect the fact that the overwhelming majority of Israelis tend to gravitate to the middle of the political scene. And it looks
But let me just ask you, we just went through an election. In fact, there have been a series of elections when the parties of the right have won. And indeed, in the closing days of this election, Prime Minister Netanyahu ran hard to the right. And that proved to be a very effective strategy for him. So in some ways, aren't the election results reflective of society's political views?
No, they are reflective of the fact that there isn't a single major party in Israel that reflects the overwhelming majority of the electorate in Israel. And the left has lost the confidence of the Israeli public opinion because it promised peace, and whatever the left promised was proven to be unrealistic, particularly vis-à-vis the Palestinians. Let me give you my interpretation of what has happened to the Israelis. we used to have a very deep difference between right and left, and most of the Israelis, most of the electorate in Israel has adopted at the same time the most important paradigm of the right and the most important paradigm of the left. From the right, it adopted the notion that there is no realistic Palestinian partner for peace, that you can't trust Arabs, particularly radical Arabs, to provide Israel with peace, that you may continue to work very well with the Egyptians or the Jordanians, but certainly not with the Palestinians. And what it adopted from the left is the understanding that the whole idea of Greater Israel, where you incorporate the West Bank into Israel and make everybody there a citizen, is not reasonable, is not acceptable from a Zionist point of view. Forget about trying to please the Arabs. From an Israeli point of view, this will be a calamity.
So, in other words, the incorporation of the Palestinians living in the West Bank isn't compatible with a long-term Jewish state in Israel, because ultimately then the majority of the population would be Arab Palestinian.
Yes, this is what the majority of Israeli public opinion adopted from the left side of the political spectrum. This realization, this understanding is today very much accepted by mainstream Israelis, including by the majority of Likud voters. But because of the Israeli system of elections, the primaries in Israel, as much as the primaries in the United States and in other democratic parties destroyed the political system, it also destroyed it in Israel. So the members of Likud are relatively deep in the right, but the voters of Likud are not there. And the only reason that Likud could get so much support is that people assumed that Benjamin Netanyahu will not go with the radical right, namely is not seeking the incorporation of the West Bank into Israel.
Well, let me just pick up on something that you said then. The first part of it you said is that sort of mainstream Israeli political opinion has adopted this view that there is no one they can negotiate with for peace on the Palestinian side. Many people would say the Israelis have also demonstrated that they're not realistic about peace, and evidence of that is the sort of rapid expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, which is completely anathema to the Palestinians.
Yes, but you see, this is the kind of nonsense you hear a lot about in the international press and from the deep left in Israel, but the overwhelming majority of Israelis don't accept it. Now, if you want to discuss what is happening to Israeli public opinion, the question of what people in Europe or in the United States think is not so relevant. I'm speaking about the overwhelming majority of Israelis, and the overwhelming majority of Israelis know that the burden of not having any kind of agreement, not any kind of compromise with the Palestinians is primarily the responsibility of the Palestinians. Not that that Israel is perfect, but look, the Palestinians have been offered in 2008 a Palestinian state over 100% of the magnitude of the territory that Jordan had before the 1967 in the West Bank. And the fact that the Palestinians rejected it, and rejected it again and again and again from 1947 and on, and the last time when Olmert proposed it in 2008, convinced mainstream Israelis, together with the Second Intifada in the year 2000, that there is no partner on the Palestinian side. The overwhelming majority of Israelis would not accept either what the Europeans are saying or what the Americans are saying under Obama, under the Obama administration. I think most Israelis understand that Israel needs to wait out Obama, wait until there is a serious president in the White House that understands what he's doing, because what we've seen is not only Israel, but every ally of the United States very much concerned about the cluelessness of the Obama administration in the region. This is not just Israel. This is Israel and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Gulf countries.
But I don't think when you look specifically at the Israel-Palestinian issue, I don't think there is a wide gulf between President Obama and the Europeans. I think that's actually... There may be some differences on other subjects, but with respect to Israel, I think both Europe and the U.S. would very much like to see peace talks to move forward there, and frankly, they're going nowhere.
both Europe and the Obama administration are clueless about the Middle East. They have this very ridiculous notion as if a peace with the Palestinians can stabilize the region. They don't understand that the Palestinian issue is irrelevant to what is happening in the Middle East. Everything important in the Middle East has zero impact from the Palestinian issue.
Well, let me ask you then about a couple points that you touched on. You said that many Israelis are sort of waiting for the end of the Obama administration. It's clear that if a Republican is elected, they're certainly going to have a probably more strongly pro-Israel viewpoint. It's likely that if Hillary Clinton is elected or one of the other Democrats, they may as well. I do get the sense, particularly since Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke before Congress earlier this year, there was this narrative in the press that Israel is somehow becoming a partisan issue because that was seen as so divisive, particularly among some Democrats. Polling shows that there's strong support for Israel in the United States. This seemed to be an inflection point. Is there a divergence now between American public opinion and Israeli public opinion?
Israel has enormous support in American public opinion. We're speaking, depending how you measure it, between 2/3 and 3/4 of American public opinion supports Israel. Unfortunately, with the Obama administration, it isn't working so well. And also, all the public opinion polls show us that Democrats are becoming less supportive of Israel. But even among Democrats, there is a majority that supports Israel. So, yes, I'm sorry to say there is a partisan element that is now stronger than before, but still the support is overwhelming. And I hope that when the United States gets a president, Democratic or Republican, that has a better understanding of what is happening in the Middle East and is more realistic about what is happening in the region, then things will change. Because again, the overwhelming majority of Israelis understand that what the deep right proposed for many years is not only unrealistic in terms of getting the Palestinians to agree with it, but also detrimental to Israel and to the Zionist objective of having a Jewish state. So at the same time, you have a total rejection of the fantasies that the Obama administration came with, particularly Kerry in his attempts, and at the same time an understanding that separating from the Palestinians, disengaging, is a good thing. Personally, I've been advocating for more than 40 years unilateral disengagement, namely that Israel gets out of the overwhelming majority of the West Bank without an agreement with the Palestinians, because I believe that getting out of there is very important from a Zionist point of view, and getting an agreement with the Palestinians is totally unrealistic because you have nobody on the Palestinian side you can seriously negotiate it with.
Dan Schueftan, thanks so much for joining us on Global Journalist. That'll do it for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Many thanks to Patrick Strickland, Greg Myre, and Dan Schueftan for joining us. Global Journalist executive producer is Joshua Kransberg. Our assistant producers this week are Pablo Gabilondo and Beatriz Ciordia. Global Journalist studio director is Travis McMillan from RJI, and our audio engineer is Pat Akers of KBIA. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.